Welcome, week 17, talking wide receivers. You got Ricky Sanders, all fantasy draft up here with Jim McCormick in his, I don't even know what that outfit is. I guess it's a New York subway at 2 a.m. outfit
There you go.
there that he's got going on. But we will be talking wide receivers. Before we get there, we've got to tell you about the RotoCurve big game promotion, rotocurve.com/big-game. You can win free tickets plus fan experience events to this event, which is a 4-night trip to Houston, February 2nd to the 6th, with 2 tickets to the game, upgraded lower level end zone seats, VIP tickets to the Antonio Brown celebrity game, all the airfare your heart could desire, all you can eat Texas tailgate, and that pregame party with Joe Montana and Warren Moon. So don't miss out. Go ahead and check it out. All right, Jim, you said you got a lot of values at the wide receiver and running back positions. We already talked running backs. Why don't you tell us who your diamonds in the rough are at receiver?
Well, in cash, I'm not really unearthing much. I'm actually just I'm willing to spend up for some studs here in cash. Jordy Nelson is kind of a building block for me. I mean, the Lions have, like I said, have allowed one of the highest completion percentages, or the highest completion percentage in the history of the league. It's obviously a mature sample. Here we are on the doorstep of history. And Rodgers has averaged a ridiculous 148.9 passer rating, targeting Nelson over this 5-game winning streak. We know Perfect's 158.3. He's hauled in 81% of his targets over this span. So, they move him in the slot. They move him outside. I know, like earlier in the season, he had some separation issues. None of that seems like an issue anymore. He's the Jordy Nelson he's the elite wide receiver 1. And I think on a week with Antonio Brown out, I mean, the Giants aren't sitting anybody, but with Josh Norman involved, and there's really no incentive. They have no mobility within their in the playoff bracket in their berth for the Giants. They're fixed at the 5. It's really it's not that intriguing, for me to go to spend up for Beckham. So I think Jordy Nelson is the guy I'm spending up for. If not, I also don't mind going for Mike Evans. I actually think Nelson is safer, just because his target share on this elite offense is just so secure. Plus, if I'm going to be paying the same price, I'd rather get targets from Aaron Rodgers and targets from Jameis Winston if we're just looking things 1-to-1. But Mike Evans is in a great position. You could argue he's better for tournaments because the targets are down. He's in that 8 to 10, maybe 7 to 9 target range, as opposed to that 12 to 15 he was doing before. But, the Carolina's, cornerbacks are young and exploitable. I'm not going to pay for both of these guys, but I will have as my wide receiver too, a lot of Doug Baldwin. Without Lockett and without that team being able to run. I know that you can run on the Niners, but, the Seattle has been one of the worst run games in the league this year. They've been held below 3 yards per carry 7 times this season, the most in the league. They've actually only done that 4 times from 2012 to 2015. So it's quite a departure from what they used to be able to do. I just think Baldwin, career highs last week in targets, yards, and receptions. His previous career high was against San Francisco in week 2. I think they could feast. I also really like Michael Thomas here. I think he's a cheap way to get in. If you're not going to have Drew Brees and pay up for Brees, and you want to go Stafford or Bortles or somebody cheaper at quarterback, I think it's fine to get Michael Thomas. He actually averages more points on the road than at home, so he's not bound to the magic of the Superdome like some of his teammates. He's caught 77% of his passes this year, which is kind of ridiculous. It's kind of that Saints mold, though. A lot of them are close to the line of scrimmage. Let him do his thing. And the Falcons aren't a good defense. They've allowed the 3rd highest touchdown rate in the league. So those are my main guys in cash. Other than that, I also really like Golden Tate. I just think after those first 6 weeks of the season, if we wipe those out, since then, he's had 25% of the targets, 28% of the yards, 30% of the yards, rather, 20% of the receptions. So there's just a lot of upside. The Packers still can't stop the pass. We saw that last week. I think no one's going to do an Adam Thielen again, but I do think that Tate could easily go over 110 catches.
Yeah, I'm with you on virtually all those. I mean, Jordy Nelson, with or without Darius Slay, I'm not really that worried about that. I mean, Jordy
he still did some damage on Rhodes. last week, even in the first half. So
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm not really that worried about that. I think there are multiple ways you could go receiver this week, especially on, the three receiver sites or even the ones with the flex, is you could go 2 stars. I mean, I think you could go Jordy Nelson and Mike Evans. I also would put Julio Jones up there. I think this is a week where he finds himself over 100 yards. I know he was on a snap count last week, but I don't think that's the case this week. I think the other guys are probably safer, and Jones is probably better served for tournaments. But he is worthy of cash games, at least in some facet. Besides that, I got a couple different guys than you. I like Julian Edelman. I already mentioned I like Brady in the quarterback section, but this is a guy, Edelman, who they've kind of started going to again. I mean, you look at before last week when he caught 5 for 89 on 8 targets, he had 17, 11, 12, 15, and 12 targets in his previous 5 games. So that was, we weren't sure if Chris Hogan and these other guys were going to affect his production earlier in the year, but he's back to being a cash game machine. And in a game that the Patriots need to win, I think I really like Edelman for cash games, but that's only if you want to go mid-tier. I'm with you on Michael Thomas. I think that's my favorite wide receiver per dollar, especially on FanDuel. I think that he's the top guy there. It is a little bit of a frustrating situation where there's Snead and there's Cooks, and they any of them could get their work. But I like Thomas the best of the bunch this week. And then if you're going cheap and you need a guy for either flex or your third receiver, if you're going to go, Evans, Jordy Nelson, there are 2 cheap guys that I really like. I mean, you mentioned Golden Tate, but I kind of like Anquan Bolden on DraftKings at 4,100 if Riddick's still out. I just think this is a game where Stafford's throwing the ball 40 plus times. And with that being the case, I mean, of course, Tate's going to get his targets, but Anquan Bolden quietly gets his as well. And he also gets them in the red zone. So against a Green Bay team where, they're implied to score, I guess it's only 23 points, but, it's one of the highest over-unders. They're a touchdown below the highest, 49.5. I think Bolden's going to see a fair amount of volume. And if you really want a guy who I think is a lock for cash games, it's Brandon LaFell, the guy who's seen 19 targets in the last 2 weeks. Now they're playing Baltimore. I'm pretty sure Andy Dalton threw the ball 48 times the last time, basically because this is a lockdown rushing defense. And it was kind of my theory for Ben Roethlisberger last week. Now, Le'Veon Bell was a little bit better than I thought he would be, but Roethlisberger, was an advantage to the heavily owned Drew Brees when everyone was on him. I mean, Roethlisberger still put up 20 fantasy points through that late-minute touchdown to Antonio Brown that saved everything. And, this team doesn't have a Le'Veon Bell, so they're going to have to throw. And, 13 receptions the last 2 weeks for over 220 yards and a touchdown for Brandon LaFell against a defense that may or may not be with Jimmy Smith. I think LaFell is a lock for cash games. He seems like their number one guy over Boyd at this point. Who do you like for tournaments this week?
Yeah, no, actually, I love LaFell as well. I kind of pushed him to tournaments just because he's Brandon LaFell, but meaning I just don't try. He's not the best player, but the usage and the role is so great, right? And I think we do have an issue sometimes getting stuck on guys who I don't think are very good, but it doesn't matter sometimes, right? Like you said, the usage is there. He's got the highest average depth of target on the team, so he's their deep threat and their number one volume guy. That's usually a good combination for fantasy points. I think T.Y. Hilton still has the ceiling that I want in tournaments. I just don't like the Jalen Ramsey lineup. Again, we also kind of overdo matchups, but Jalen Ramsey's playing really well over the last 6 weeks. He's been effective. He's a good young player. I'm not sure if he shadows. I'm not going to guess that. I don't know. But it's just a factor. But then again, Hilton does so much work from the slot, right? That if they don't move him around, then Hilton's not really encumbered by that matchup. And then he goes against guys like Devon House and Cyprian, the safety. Like, these guys are really easy to exploit. So, yeah, I think Hilton still has that 29, 30-point ceiling that we like. Here's a name that you're not going to really – that's like Alshon Jeffrey. I mean, he's $5,900. I don't really appreciate him in any other format. But in tournaments and as a low-owned guy, sub 6K on DraftKings, there's some interest there, right? The floor is really low. It's incredibly low. But the ceiling's high enough. I think most people will be willing to go to Cameron Meredith, which makes sense, but it's not that much more to get up into to get to Jeffrey. And he's been disappointing this year, but there's certainly some motivation for this guy to play well on the last game. I still like Pierre Garçon. I still think – I know Reed's on the way back here, but I still don't trust that Reed's Reed. I still think that the market share for Garçon is still steady enough that there's some upside in tournaments, and he's actually had some scoring upside this season. So other than that, I think Brandon Cooks is also a guy. If you're not going to get into Michael Thomas, I think there's a way to get Brandon Cooks. He's he's a little bit more expensive actually, but the ceiling is pretty ridiculous. Just in the big play sense, he's kind of a super version of Deshaun in the sense that Jackson doesn't really score touchdowns anymore, but 3 or 4 catches for 180 yards and 2 touchdowns sounds like a reasonable line for that guy. So that to me reeks of tournaments. And then Allen Robinson, I'm going back to the well there. You're going back to the well with some guys you like. I'm going back to Allen Robinson. They move the ball around. I was on a podcast this week, and they were asking, it was about kind of, disappointing players you still trust, and he was one of the key guys because, the skill set's there. On tape, he still looks awesome. He's still Allen Robinson. Nothing happened to this guy. He's still only in his 3rd year. I actually think this year is kind of his bad Mike Evans year, like Evans had last year. I think this guy gets right back into being elite, but they moved him around last week, and look at the results. And against this Indy defense, I think you can exploit them. And then Steve Smith. I don't know what you think about Steve Smith, but just the narrative street. Take a drive down narrative street. It's a meaningless game, but Harbaugh's already talking it up. He's getting him a ton of targets. I can see him getting 12, 13 targets. That alone kind of intrigues me.
Yeah, I agree with a bunch of those. It's a tough week for tournaments because all the same guys I like in cash I would use there. So
I agree. Nelson and Evans and Baldwin. These are the guys with the highest, most interesting ceilings too.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think there's just plays this week for the most part, but there are a few guys that I would dictate more towards tournaments. How about JJ Nelson? This
good one.
Rams team really is not good against wide receivers when you look at it. You look at the DVOA numbers, you look at the fantasy point numbers. I mean, wide receivers are a good spot to attack them, and Nelson is a guy who seems to get beat deep every week. I mean, John Brown kind of fading out of this offense. So if you like Nelson, you could use him. I think there's a case to be made for Fitzgerald too, but Nelson definitely the more fantasy friendly cost. And then kind of secondary receivers for a bunch of the teams we've already named, right? Like Devontae Adams for the Packers. I think you could go that route. If you don't believe in Michael Thomas, you could go Cooks or Willie Snead. If you're still worried about Julio Jones, or you just think that New Orleans has a history of covering him, or whatever you want to go a different route, I think you could go Sanu. If it looks like Taylor Gabriel's going to be out, or you could even go further down the depth chart. I think it's Aldrick Robinson's the next one up if Gabriel's out.
He's a tournament name. He's a good tournament name. That's good.
Yeah. So if Gabriel's in, I would definitely consider him. If he's not, it's Aldrick Robinson. So I'm just going further down the depth charts of these offenses that I like. Because like we mentioned in quarterbacks, I think there are teams that are putting up a lot of points, and those are the ones I want to trust. And I guess another off name you could go to is Eli Rogers if Antonio Brown is out and you trust Landry Jones. I think I can see some upside there. But besides that, I mean, literally all the names I mentioned, the Tates, the Boldens, the LaFells, the Edelmans, all those guys, I think they have tournament upside as well, with the teams needing to win. Maybe the last name that I'll just throw out there, Terrell Pryor, his price all the way down to 4,200, playing in Pittsburgh.
Gets Kessler back. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's the last name. Did we miss anything at wide receiver?
No, we mentioned a ton of guys, and I think in roster construction we can go over how to kind of fit these pieces in.
Yep. So let's end on that note. Ton of wide receivers this week, but hopefully we made some sense of it for you. But before we go, rotocurve.com/big-game, rotocurve.com/big-game. You can win some free tickets and fan experience events to Big Game 51, sponsored by RotoCurve. It's a 4-night trip with all kinds of sweet amenities, including, tailgate, airfare, and a pregame party with Joe Montana and Warren Moon. So don't miss out on that. Jim and I will be back talking roster construction and helping you win in Week 17.